Okay, thank you all for coming back. I would politely ask you to adjourn your conversations. We do have about 30 minutes, and then you can break for second lunch, which is great. As mentioned, really appreciate your participation and feedback thus far. It is super, super helpful, really. We've talked about the guild, we've talked about the different FIP types. What I would like to ask for your kind of thinking on is one of the hardest pieces of this, and that is how do we actually vote? So we've talked about this complex consensus idea. All right. Voting is super hard. It's very challenging. For Filecoin, this is especially true, I believe. There is a presumed model for voting in ecosystems like this, which says that you have a token, and you say I have 100 tokens, and so my voting is 100x compared to everyone else, depending on how many tokens they have. Pretty simple. I go say yes, no, records it, and we move on. With Filecoin, this is really challenging because the Filecoin token is not just a store of value. It represents utility, and it has lots and lots of different purposes on this network, right? So for us to simply say, oh, everyone go vote, and we look in your wallet and we see how much fill you have, and we call it a day, is going to lead to some wildly disproportionate results and an effective capture of our actual decision making. So the challenge for us is to specify an accountable, quantifiable way of measuring contribution and making sure that the way we measure this actually represents an appropriate weight of governing influence over the decisions that people are asked to make. The ultimate goal is to have a system that is obviously documented. You can deep dive into the spec and understand how it works. There's a real lightweight UI that you just go, you connect your wallet, and you press vote. But the way we actually tabulate the results of this is what I'm asking you to help us think through today. So the way we've been thinking about this is by breaking it out into 5 different quadrants, right? Where a person will cast a vote. Each of the quadrants accounts to a different kind of metric, a different measure of network utility and contribution. And whatever metric applies to you gets counted in that category as a vote. So for example, if I go and connect my Glyph wallet with all my Filecoin in it, obviously, it's going to see that I have a bunch of developer activity in GitHub, which we have tooling to support. I have X number of tokens. I do not have any deal bytes. I do not have any raw byte power. But I'm able to cast votes and have weight in 2 of these categories, right? For a storage provider, for example, they may have RBP, they're going to have deal bytes, they may have a lot of tokens, and they may also be GitHub contributors. They may have a very high weight across all of these categories. Same thing for core developers, for example, or others who are participating in this ecosystem. The idea here is to categorize groups by appropriate weight so that, again, if there is someone with a disproportionate amount of weight to everyone else, they are not able to singularly capture this entire process. But again, if you are contributing in many ways across this ecosystem, that in and of itself compounds on your overall ability to voice what you think we should be doing for certain FIPs. Where did this come from, you may ask? This is an updated version of what we did most recently when core devs asked for there to be a vote on FIP 36. The key difference, there's a few things that have been tweaked. But namely, we did sort of a grouping to say 3 out of 5 groups have to approve yes or no. A lot of our feedback we got from the community is this was really confusing. I know this is very confusing, but what we would like to do is be able to actually proportion these out so that we can say there is 51% approval, it's a sum of approvals from all of the categories, et cetera, et cetera. I am going to just pause. Questions? Galen?
Yeah, I have a question on the GitHub developer section.
Yep.
You said we have like tooling to measure it, but just drilling in a little bit, when
Yep.
I connect my GitHub, is it going to be looking at a type of activity in a type of repo, or is that still gameable? Is there a threshold that says I have to have a certain
Yep.
bar of activity, or more activity counts as a higher weight of a developer?
Yep.
Similar to having more tokens would count as more of a token holder vote?
Yes. So first of all, before I answer your question, all of this is written out in a spec, which is public. And I would love for everyone in this room to take a look at it and add comments and questions and raise issues and flag them, right? But yes, so the idea, I think the leading idea we have now is that there's going to be kind of two levels here. So one is sort of the rote standard that we've used in other places, including Filecoin Plus, I believe, for your direct data cap allocation, which says, here is the minimum threshold. If you have a GitHub account that is whatever, between 1 and 60 days old, and we can randomize this so that it is not always the same, which is an important defense mechanism on these things, and you have committed to at least 2 different repos, or you've at least made 2 commits, whatever the baseline threshold is, if yes, then you get a weight of 1. I am a fan, personally, of adding sort of a second tier where you also get additional weight if the commits that you're making are to Filecoin core repos, right? So you get a weight of 1 just by committing generally to projects. Great, cool, nice, open source, good. But if you are consistently making a ton of commits to core Filecoin code bases, that should count for more. And so the example would be someone like just some person who wishes to vote. Maybe they contribute to other PLN type projects. They get a small weight in this category. Someone like me who has a lot of commits to 1 or 2 Filecoin repos, I will get sort of a middle tier of weight. And someone like Jennifer, for example, ton of commits to a bunch of different core repos, you would get a significantly higher weight in this category. So 2 tiers, which would be specified and are in the spec. Does that answer your question? Nice.
I think Jennifer has thoughts.
Yep.
Interesting you call my name because I was thinking I do participate in a lot of repositories, but I don't necessarily write that much of code compared to people like a usual Microsoft or whatever, or like maybe even never this year. So I know, unacceptable.
What do you do?
I don't know why I am here. I'm just.
Yeah,
Oh, just kidding.
The doors over here.
But my point here is like, before, like I believe the previous version is like core devs, right? Like we're trying to be more decentralized. I understand that. I just want to make sure that we also acknowledge there are people who are not just like code contributors in this ecosystem, are also can be considered as engineers or like devs in the Filecoin ecosystem, play important roles. Their opinions should be accounted properly as well. That's just my feedback.
Yeah, so immediately it should be, and it would be, because they can still vote as token holders, and presumably they hold tokens. Is there a use case you're thinking of where like someone is not pushing code, doesn't have tokens? I guess I don't understand.
TPMs. Like if you're making issues, you're filing bugs, but you're not merging the PR that fixes that bug. So previously, maybe to just from the IPFS land, we've actually had some thoughts related to this back in the day. There were 2 different layers of problems. One is you do really want to, reward people who are identifying issues and giving really good bug reports and contributing both in repos and projects and strategies that don't involve literally committing and merging PRs. And so that was one thing. We did contributor in IPFS means anyone who has, including submitting an issue comments, et cetera, so participation in the FIPS process where that's a discussion comment or a comment on an open issue would count as some layer of participation. You can also weight, I mean, it sucks, but like you could weight commits and PRs based on like number of lines changed or something like that. That's not great. Like that's not truly the metric by which something is meaty and significant and important. But like you could also weight different repos differently. This is a hairy issue though, and it does open you up to gaming of people who are like, cool. Now suddenly you have 300 inbound PR requests that then need to be like merged and triaged by maintainers that are for like nits and spelling changes and line changes and formatting changes, and like that's overhead. You now have less time to actually work on development because you're having to deal with and it's going to be urgent and challenging to deal with that, where you're like, cool, you're spamming the process, reject, hey, those people were doing it so that they could participate and have a weight within that categories in the governance process.
Yep.
That's now going to be like a governance issue of like, why did you merge that person's spelling suggestion fix and not my spelling suggestion fix out of the 300,000 ones of these that are now open? And so there's a risk there in how we set baselines in this system that we might actually create a lot more work and friction and overhead for developers, which I don't think any of us want.
Yeah, I also think this is, I mean, these are all correct and good points, right? It is challenging, and I think for like an initial, we already have an MVP, but for like actual rollout, like perfection in capturing contributions cannot be the enemy of having a working product for this purpose. I think over-specifying it too quickly, one, from a tooling perspective, is going to be super hard, and also it might not actually lead to better outcomes. So there is a problem where commits themselves are not going to be a very good index, and I think that's like the problem to drill into. But I think capturing like the entire breadth of contributions in the way that we're currently getting them has like a design focus early on may lead us into like a place where we have like more people just trying to like, there might be more perverse incentives, and like the margins we're trying to capture are not worth introducing like other challenges. Does that make sense? Yeah, yep.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think like part of this is solved by like a low bar, and then they're
Yep.
just getting a 1, and then a like very high ceiling like threshold in order to get the like higher tier, but that it is not necessarily like a linear. If you're a developer and you've done X number of commits that have been approved, like you're scaling your power. It's like, you know, thresholds into a category. So the people that are trying to game it are going to do the minimum thing, but then they only get the like 1x.
Yeah.
And it's like, we made one comment somewhere.
Right.
Okay, great, move on.
I think the right way to think about this, just like these are not correct numbers, but to apply numbers so that we can scale them appropriately. The example before of like some random person committing 2 repos across the PLN versus me as a contributor versus Steb as an example, who commits a ton of code, whatever. I kept wanting to say his like Slack handle name. The actual like percentage breakdown of who is committing what, if you could calculate it, maybe 1% to that guy, 10% to me, right? And however many the rest percentage to Steb. The actual weight would look like 1, 2, and 3, if that makes sense, right? It's not going to be highly accurate, but it is more correct than trying to over-specify.
Handstack, I think, was Marco, Colin, Jennifer.
So I'm not a fan of this, I have to say. I won't bash it too much, but like few concerns.
Sure.
What is the window of GitHub commits in the past that you're going to look at? Is it a month? Is it a history? Is it like what? That's one. The other is if a co-developer is not a token holder, would they need to get up to 20% of the votes? Why do they not hold tokens and just rely on maybe gameable commits on GitHub to get power? Especially since there you don't have Sybil attack protection, so it gets like messy, like opening other accounts and stuff. So this just briefly, without me taking over the stand, to say I'm not a fan of that.
So these are both, so like the first question, so first of all, keep in mind also, like there are details of the specification, but the actual like implementation realities are still very much up for negotiation. Don't know what they'd be specified as. The term could be 60 days. I don't know what the direct data cap allocation term was for GitHub accounts. I think it was 30 days at one point. What was it? 180. And there are ways of like, again, randomizing it to make sure you don't game it. But again, the idea is like create low thresholds that are not specified enough to be highly gameable. And if they are, then we change the rules. If there are other parts of this that you want to talk about, like why you don't like this, that might be helpful also. What is it about this proposal or this type of voting that makes you think this is a bad idea?
It's just what I mentioned. I do think that token holding and storage provider power capture a lot of things that we want. I would personally stop there, but that's my opinion. So it's just that, you know,
Sure.
I hope that the developer holds tokens, right? that they're vested in the network and they're contributing. But like these gameable, and also these, because token holding and storage provider power, they're not that much gameable, right? So you need to invest work, like it's economic power versus like storage power, etc. So you need to invest something. Whether, I mean, so in commits, yeah, but we had examples that you can game this, right, fairly easily, like.
Yeah, no, I understand.
And if this is equal power, maybe if this was 5% of something, like to acknowledge the contributions, but not as powerful as a storage provider and token holders, maybe this would be more palatable. But at 20%, it seems like a bit too much.
Sure, that's a good point. So reallocating the weights across categories. Yep.
I think it was Colin, then Jennifer, then me, then Guy.
A couple things. I'd also be okay with developers to like just kind of have some process where you select who the core developers are versus trying to do it completely automated. Like, of course, if there was some application process that, hey, I want to lobby for a vote here, like Jennifer would submit, and of course you would be in that category. And then you you hand select whatever number you want based on some application process with some criteria versus trying to automate it on gameable metrics on GitHub or something like that.
Yep.
So it's kind of like, hey, we define core developers or developers as these criteria. You apply, you pre-select like 100 people or whatever that kind of fall within that, and then they vote. I know it's not like perfect and maybe arguably not super Web3, but like that might be an interim step until we figure out a better system. And then for ecosystem partners, I just pulled up the specs, so I'll read it a little bit more, but I'm trying to get my head around this one. It's kind of like, I don't know if token count is the right thing, but it's some sort of like end user impact, I think would be my mental model. Like how many end users does a major application building on Filecoin or a DeFi project or whatever like impact, and that's kind of hard to like automate and do systematically. So I wonder if there is like some other process where the foundation or some body could like say, of course these things are ecosystem partners and they should have a say based on some criteria, but it's a little bit more qualitative across a bunch of things. I know Marco's going to hate that too, so.
Yeah. So I hear these ideas, they're good. To be very clear, I want to try and facilitate like a neutral conversation as much as possible. My personal bias is against doing this. I'm very opposed to a whitelist process. Others do like the idea. As we were just discussing, my personal preference is actually not to include ecosystem partners as a category for this reason. Token count for multisigs was a placeholder. I do not actually think that's a good idea either. The other one being like whitelisting, similar for developers. The idea of like standing up that process. Jennifer's a good example. If I were reviewing applications for developer whitelisting and I got Jennifer's, I say okay. And then if I got XYZ whatever from GitHub, like it creates like all of these challenges for like trust and verification that we run into in other places in this ecosystem, and I think it's recreating problem spaces that we don't have really good solutions for. And I think, again, my own personal design bias for making choices for this, the actual specification of these 5 categories comes from the initial design of like the Filecoin community and like the 5 pillars of contribution that do exist. Obviously, if we have to make modifications, then we can do that. But the preference is to have a very light specification to avoid over-engineering and creating gameable situations. And I'm worried that that same problem also exists for whitelists beyond just the verifiability issue too.
Jennifer, you were next. Okay, maybe also on this topic, at least how I would think about each of these groups is like the value that they are bringing into the economy and into the network ecosystem, and then trying as much as possible to have any evaluation mechanism be connected to those value flows and ideally hit existing rails and not create new evaluation rails. I agree with you that I think some creating new whitelist processes for XYZ thing, like is going to review that whitelist and do all, like, that's a ton of overhead as someone who's run a grants program in the past. Like, that was, you know, a smaller number of things you're trying to distribute. It's a full-time job. Who's got time for that? And so I don't want to create a lot of process and overhead. And so I think the bias for existing systems and leaning on where the value is being created and ways in which we recognize that value today. Like for developers, something like SourceCred was aiming to be a system that would account for, like, you know, developer contribution within an ecosystem and a network. Like I wish we had another better replacement for that today. Just to throw out one idea that I think we might also shoot down, but like you could use like, hey, what is your ownership tier on repos that, you know, have a core contribution to the Filecoin project, so that you're using the existing, hey, are you a maintainer? Are you an admin? Are you a code committer? Are you an issue triager? Are you a just random community participant in those repos? So the existing process of like contributing to and governing like a set of maybe, I don't know, 10 core repos or something that are selected is like the proxy that you use for developers who are contributing to core Filecoin functionality, and then you can rely on existing governance of who gets elevated to, like, great, you have committer access because you've been doing a lot of good work over the last, you know, chunk of time, and then if you start abusing that power and spamming things, then, you know, great, you're no longer a committer to that repo. And so you can rely on maybe some existing guide rails a little bit instead of creating new processes. And I would posit then, if we're viewing each of these groups by the value that they are bringing into the economy, developers are investing a ton of their time, completely disproportionate to the amount of available resources that they would have for token ownership. Like, large party in XYZ business, large investor group, all the amazing, like, folks that, Glyph itself, who's sitting on massive amounts of tokens right now that have been, you know, invested in through many parties, will far dwarf and outweigh someone who's dedicated day in, day out, tons of time and energy and resources to actually making the protocol better. And I think this is trying to account for that human commitment of resources into the system, and making sure that those folks, we weight that significant commitment. For ecosystem partners, I think users is maybe one interesting one, though I will say, from trying to like count users of people on IPFS, it's impossible and self-reported, and everyone defines users differently, and like not easy to automate another full-time job to try and get that. Another way to look at it is maybe dollars invested into the Filecoin economy, or maybe not dollars, choose some Ethereum invested into the Filecoin economy, whatever, is like how many resources are they bringing into this ecosystem, whether that's like, you know, revenue or grants that they're funding, how much they're contributing to like other blue funds that fund development work and other things, but like that might be a metric for like the reinvestment, or how much they're investing from like a time or a business perspective. Might be a little bit easier to grab, but also challenging. I'm just trying to like align each of these groups with the contribution to the economy, and I would strongly disagree with Marco that the only people that count are token holders and storage providers. I very much do not think that is the case for value contributed into the Filecoin ecosystem and economy that we're trying to make sure, you know, it is accounted for as we continue evolving the system forward. Robin, did you have a thing?
Okay, very much agreed. But also, I think for developers, there might be some sort of middle approach between allow listing and just automatically counting contributions. Mm-hmm. It's counting contributions and having already approved developers vet other developers, so that you have a vouching tree. Yeah. And on top of that, you add a process such that a group, whatever group, can review vouchers, and then you can prune the tree. Like if someone sort of gamed the system and started, you know, vouching a bunch of bots, then you cut the tree at that root. And that's relatively easy to implement, and it doesn't have to have a lot of overhead to operationalize it.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting, because we do have this challenge of measuring, everyone has this challenge, but of measuring contribution in a scalable way. This might be a good way to experiment with doing that in like a really applied setting. Nice.
Yeah, if you have 5 commits, you're eligible for being vouched for.
Yep.
Someone who's already known to the network vouches for you or not.
Yep.
I know this person, they're real, and that's it. Then you just like iterate.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, I see a lot of people also want to talk, but I feel until now we're engineering a little bit this solution, and I would like to take a step back and ask you why actually this voting mechanism, even if we manage to engineer all those measurements,
Sure.
has that been implemented somewhere? Have we seen this kind of voting mechanism, and what are the outcomes of it?
What?
Yeah, somewhere else. Because voting mechanisms, it's a very dangerous thing to play with.
Yep. I agree. And for the last 2 years have beat the drum that we're not going to vote. Very, very dangerous, which is why, again, your thoughts and feedback are very helpful. There are lots and lots of blockchain communities in particular, obviously, that like use voting mechanisms. Some to good effect, some to very poor effect. Part of the reason why we are introducing not just voting, but also this bicameral system with a guild is to make sure that there is a check so that when we start to experiment with this and start to roll it out, that there's not some wildly unanticipated consequence or distribution of results that leads to a bunch of things automatically getting accepted or whatnot. It's also important to know that in some communities, on-chain voting also leads to an immediate upgrade or on-chain acceptance. That is very much not the case with Filecoin. So there are still human buffers in the mix. It's not ideal, but it is sort of a pragmatic necessity, if that makes sense.
But I'm asking about this particular on-chain mechanism of having those groups.
So there are lots of other ecosystems that will have like roles in voting. So a good example of this is the Polkadot network. They do it fully on-chain, and roles are randomly assigned based on like a variety of metrics. This is for Filecoin, and this is supposed to reflect the way like Filecoin is trying to like understand the utility of value as it flows through this ecosystem. We have an MVP available of this tool, but no, we have built this ourselves. Yes.
Yeah. When I see the GitHub thing, I kind of flinch because if you had a solution that's civil resistant, then you will have basically a proof of commit or something like that. There's a reason why in Filecoin, block producers are people that submit proof of spacetimes and not just that create an account or something, because there are attack vectors if there's not a civil resistant mechanism.
Yep.
And I feel like this 20% is the only one that creates a dependency to a different system that we don't control, and that controls membership altogether by itself without any kind of civil resistance. And that makes me uneasy about it.
Sure, you may be right. We may try it and it may not work and we may need to amend it. What I was trying to describe before too, when comparing like the contributions of like an unknown party, myself and Stephen or Jennifer, et cetera, right? Was to say, like, if we're thinking about weighting these votes in this category, the idea being that we would not specify exactness against one another. So there's no value in trying to game the system additionally. You fit in one of 3 weight categories, 1, 2, 3, rather than 1%, 10%, whatever, 89%. Again, it could be that it doesn't work and we make that change. However, as Molly pointed out, and then Robin also commented on, is there are lots of communities that simply reduce voting to like very simple quantifiable metrics. And in almost all of those communities, it leads to massive vote capture. The intent of introducing tooling like this is not simply to enable a decision and to process and tool decision-making over very important things, but it is to inspire an actual reflection of who's contributing and how, and trying to model that in a way that is more quantifiable and auditable than what we have now. So again, I hear your concerns, and they could come to pass, and you could very much be correct, and we can try and needle with it, and maybe it doesn't work. But I think comparing the accuracy or exactness of this metric to something like a cryptographic proof is not necessarily a fair comparison in this case, because we're not shooting for that level of exactness or preciseness. And the risk The incentive for bad behavior, I don't think is comparable in this case either. And the other thing is it's also part of why you partition it out. So if one of these categories is flawed in its specification, you do not have like a wholesale rejection of the entire thing, if that makes sense.
So I just wanted to make a comment with respect to what Molly said. So I think, stepping back, what we are trying to do with the developers and ecosystem partners is to recognize some people and entities who are contributing more than others to the whole, I'm trying to capture this, right? So to the whole success of what we are doing here, which is not necessarily reflected in storage provider power and token holding. This seems to me like somebody engaging in the like if we are non-profit or something like that, somebody volunteering and working in the field, and we want to recognize this. And I guess if you ask us all over the room, we will agree on certain subset of people. Yes, these are the people who should be in this group, at least in the time window of the last 1 year. But this may change in time. So this seems to me like a representative voting. So like we, for some definition of we, which might again be token holders or something like that, we vote for like who should be recognized in this time window, and we give them more power, what they need to nominate themselves probably as like core devs, or ecosystem partners, and then we vote for them. Are we aiming for something like that? That's like that model would change in time. So that's more flexible in time. You need to define who are the voters for the voters, like for proxy voting, but that at least would alleviate the need to fix today, to fix this in stone, like 20%, and who are these people to have it automated. So maybe we should go that way. I'm not proponent of this, I'm just trying to be collaborative more than usual.
Thank you. That's a great instinct that I think a lot of us should have. No, so what you're describing is delegative voting. Yes, that is a much more sophisticated system. Secretly, that is my goal long-term with this, that we move towards that system. We cannot do that right now. This is a first step towards that system. And the category is another way of thinking about this. There's a lot of defensive design reasons for doing it this way and partitioning it out. But the other reason is that it, to your point, creates a representative model of different functions, which ends up feeding into a system that, again, could become delegative. The tooling for delegative voting is much more difficult, and the actual impacts and risks of delegative voting are much higher when you have no initial data to work off of. You've never done polling before or voting before. It is significantly more difficult to get an interpretable and dependable result in delegative systems. Especially, I mean, in Filecoin, where we have very little view into who and how people are holding tokens specifically. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep.
Project. Yeah, generally a fan of this. My biggest concern with it is it looks like a lot of work.
Yes.
This is going to be hard to design, get all the feedback, implement, and then tweak as various edge cases show up. Yep. But that's a you problem.
Thank you, Molly.
Couple quick questions as someone who's not read the spec because I'm a bad person. What is pass? Is 51% to pass? Is 49% to fail? Or do we have a pass-fail?
We do indeed. So do you remember when we did FIP 36 with Philpol? I don't know if you were in the room when I said this earlier, but when we did it that way and we broke out similar-ish categories, we did this kind of like group thing where we're like, 3 out of 5 groups must have 51% or greater. Complicated.
Yeah.
The idea of doing percentages is so that they can be additive, and it's like a 51% is a yes.
Sure.
Yeah.
That makes sense, I think. Maybe 51% is, we can maybe discuss the number.
Yeah.
Will there be any vetoes, as we also had in FIP 36? Can one group veto a thing?
Good question. In the voting process specifically, no. But this, for crypto economic and governance changes that we would get as FIPs, It is this plus the guild, remember. So we have that complex consensus, and you can think of the guild as having a veto function over it.
Makes sense.
And vice versa.
Makes sense. I think my biggest concern is essentially, I didn't like the veto idea either. I don't think it just leads to complication and confusion. Storage providers, I worry, do have to be weighted privileged in some capacity, not because I think they're the most important, but because I think storage providers are the only group that can concretely reject a change, a proposed change. Storage clients are obviously very important for the ecosystem, but if they don't really like a change, the change will just happen anyway. But if the group of storage providers really don't like a change, all they have to do is not upgrade the software. And so I think I think our community is healthy and thriving. There's a lot of good discussion, but I worry about a situation where the process supports a change, and so we all implement it and ship it out, but the process doesn't account for the fact that one group can veto a change whether we write it down or not.
Yeah, so this representational accuracy is the most important thing to get right. Having poor representation in vote outcomes manifests itself in a lot of different ways. So it can look like wildly disproportionate scales of contribution in different categories. So if you have people, I don't even know what an accurate comparative number would be, off the top of my head. But if you're looking at the storage provider category and you're seeing a huge proportion of raw byte power compared to total raw byte power on the network being accounted for in votes, and then you're looking at the developers category and you see that there are 4 individuals likely voting, that is a disproportionate representation of voting intent. And it means that even though these categories are weighted equally, ones that have really high participation actually get a proportionate less weight for individuals casting votes just because of the count in that category, right? This is something, part of the reason why all of these are weighted equally now. One, there is sort of a pragmatic, everyone is important equally, yes? But the other thing is, realistically, we don't know what the appropriate weight should be, and it may need to shift. Same thing with introducing a minimum threshold, which someone brought up earlier, of saying, so if 3 people vote in the developers category, do we count it? That's not robust. Right. Part of this is we just don't have any data to know what appropriate thresholds may be, and part of this sort of experimentation is determining those so that we can specify with greater accuracy. And you're very right. We may need to change it.
Yeah. I want to pull a Danny O'Brien. I have 4 points to make.
Well, do them one at a time so that I can address them and not forget one.
Okay, so one of the questions is, how will we adjust these thresholds over time? Will that be a FIP for each of the change?
Yes.
Cool. 2, taking it back to, or actually no, 2 is how will they be measured and tracked? Is there a dashboard that's being built that's going to say, we ran this, we had this many participants in this category that were at this threshold. How far can we drill into that? What's the accountability and metric presentation? That exist?
Oh, sorry, I forgot I asked you to pause. There is not a dashboard being built. We have money for this. Thank you to the Filecoin Foundation. It is all going into tooling. All of this is open source. Anyone can build tooling to measure and audit these things, to do these displays. In the interim, your Filecoin Foundation governance team will be doing all of the data science.
All right.
Yeah.
And then 3, taking it back to, I think it was one of Robin's points earlier of can we live with this for the day? And I think there's a lot of opinions on it of what's the threshold, but how does it get gamed? And we kind of have to try to then see. And I would challenge people to take back that mindset of rooting it back into the core principles of why do these constituency groups matter? Is it safe enough to push this forward, knowing that we have these other checks and balances through these other systems, and knowing that we can iterate on it in the future. And then the 4th point, because I'm not pausing, is that we're 7 minutes over time, and I want to just do a time check.
Thank you.
Because at 1 o'clock in this room, we'll be doing Filecoin Plus stuff, so people may need time for a break and food. But I know there's some other comments, so
I think I see one hand up from George. Let's give George, you can have the last word. That is a good time check. There's not much time left. I will be here all day.
Yeah, don't give me the last word. I think Molly also has something to say. It's probably nicer. But No, I mean, I just want to build on what Ayush said, right? I mean, we can talk about, updating thresholds and optimizing things and adjusting as needed.
Yep.
But in the end, it's the same question as the guild decides something and the community decides something else. In the end, the question is what happens if the storage providers say no to something and everyone else says yes? I mean, it's what we were discussing earlier, right?
Yep.
I mean, they're not forking, you're forking. Like
Yep.
they
But
own the
you end up
network.
with an Ethereum 2.0, right? That's what that looks like. You
Yeah.
end up with where you've done a community governance process. One particular body has been like, hell nah. All the other bodies have been like, look, this is in the best interest of the ecosystem, da 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 da. Like, there's the bicameral system, they're checking and balancing against each other. So it's like a pretty high bar, right?
Yeah.
To do that. Like Ethereum merge took like years. So it's a very high bar to get to, but, and I would not advocate for it, but I think that's what that looks like, of like, cool, this now, makes some change to the minting rate schedule that does something that's like, we've looked at groups across different areas have like voted for it. There's, and the community has gone through a governance process to take that step forward. And there's a, say 50% or something, some chunk of storage providers that have been like, cool, but we don't say yes. And then you either end up with a fork or you end up with, that community governance process having a weight within the community about which trajectory the ecosystem is moving forward. And, folks who want to move forward with that community trajectory, continue on as part of it. But yeah, it's a heavy bar, and that should be a factor, obviously, that every other community group is significantly taking into account as we look and balance something like a representative voting versus like a guild level discussion where people are like, hey, this has like very significant challenges here. Like what is that going to look like and how are we going to move through it as a community? But again, at the end of the day, being able to move through a fork is also something that many other communities have experienced as well.
No, absolutely. I mean, I agree with you entirely. But I think the concrete question is really from the process perspective, what happens the next day, right? I mean, the votes are in, the decision is in. How do we move on from there, right? I mean, do we say, okay, so we're going to start working towards spawning a separate network? Is that the outcome? I mean, we need to understand that because otherwise the process is useless, right? I mean, if you don't have an answer for what happens if that case comes to pass, it's like...
I think these are separate issues. I do want to say, so if you end up in a position where as like a community of whatever people, right, you consistently have a singular monolithic antagonistic block, something in the design of your governance system fundamentally is wrong. That is a very difficult and unlikely thing to sustain, and it indicates that there is some failure of legitimacy in how you are presenting, deliberating, and agreeing upon issues, right? Storage providers as like a block, if we want to talk about them as one, do have different incentives than other people in this network, and that's by design. But I think sometimes we overemphasize this idea of as storage providers as antagonistic or oppositional to other changes, simply because we've had that experience with certain recent FIPS, and to be frank with you, that is the result of not having enough adequate governing processes to account for disagreement and then adequately process it. I truly believe that as we move towards, again, more robust feature sets, providing new outlets and pathways for people to engage in this process and to legitimately feel like they have a way to make a difference when things matter to them, right, in a way that feels fair, one, it becomes a lot easier to accept things that you disagree with if you think that the process overall is working in your interests, right? But secondly, I also just don't think, I personally am not over-indexing on the idea that storage providers as a block of people are going to organize in this way. And if they do, well, then they can fork. That is your fundamental, two governing rights everyone has. You can fork, you can leave. It's up to you.
Yeah, maybe just as a design an idea that maybe we can talk about over lunch is to mitigate this challenge is to do these two things not in parallel but in sequence. So for example, you could do your like community voting levels, and for example, if the storage providers were like, you know, very against from a community voting perspective, that can then be evaluated from a guild perspective, also related to turnout, of like, okay, well, how many people actually did participate in the governance process? If it's like, you know, you had low acceptance rate, but also very low participation, like, all right, that's overall not as meaningful for many folks to like get up and engage with the system. And so the community guild and the representation, you know, for XYZ group in the community guild can also then discuss and check and balance, like, hey, based on the results of the voting, we're running into these or various different risks, and we should, you know, have an abundance of caution, or you know, be very thoughtful about that. But I do think if you got to a situation in which, you know, some subset of these groups was even significantly against, but overall the majority votes in favor and the community guild votes in favor, we would be moving forward with executing the set of things that fall into this process, where again, for technical FIPS, this is optional, and then for crypto economic and governance FIPS, this is required. And I think this is, and so for that subset of things, that would be like, you know, maybe the community guild is like, cool, we're identifying we need additional levels of check and balance, or maybe the community guild can request that we do another vote or something if there was low enough representation, or there's concerns where you have kind of like a split community guild that like feels like we don't have enough, you know, network participation in order to truly recognize the risks and like community will within that. But just as an idea to offset them will help use your bicameral system to evaluate the outcomes from the vote, and then reincorporate that, giving you some structure that'll weight based on participation as well.
A great final comment. And with that, we have 15 minutes for lunch. Thank you all. It's been 3 hours of participation. And again, really, thank you. Great. Goodbye. Okay.